Welcome back, everybody. So we've had an inspiration opening from our peer. We've crunched some numbers with our thought leaders, put things into wider context with the panel, and had a dynamic chat with a construction trailblazer. Yes, indeed. But now it's time to go back to school. We need to go into some deep history, yes. Because the spirit of Black British entrepreneurialism goes back a long way. You saw some of those pictures earlier on, and you might have thought, okay, I wasn't sure about that. When did that happen? Well, let's put everything into context. I'm delighted to say that the person who's going to take us through this history in a really engaging way, as befits the television style that he's become very well known for, is one of Britain's most celebrated historians. Before he comes up on stage, please take a look at him in action. Professor David Olusoga OBE.
If you think about the experiences of post-war black migrants to Britain, this was a community that couldn't get housing that was not from slum landlords. This was people who couldn't be accepted as customers in businesses, in banks and shops. The idea that the world of finance or the world of entrepreneurship was open to people who couldn't be accepted as customers, never mind as entrepreneurs, I think created a mindset that was deselecting. I think people felt that these doors were closed even when maybe they were more open than we might have imagined. I think if you look, for example, at the history of the Caribbean, the deeply entrepreneurial places, look at the history of West Africa, incredibly entrepreneurial. That hasn't been translated as effectively as it could be in communities when they've come here to Britain. I think there's lots of historic reasons for that. But history can tell us what we've done in the past. The answer is to solve it.
Public history at the University of Manchester, Professor David Olusoga OBE.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here, wonderful to be invited to speak. I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes and then we've got about 15 minutes for questions. As always, I've prepared, and as always, I'll wander away from my notes, so I'll have to keep returning to them. But I wanted to sort of begin as we began this morning. The first image that we saw in this room this morning was that of John Blank, trumpeter to the court of the Tudors, a man who arrived in this city, we think, in 1503, 520 years ago, 18 generations ago, a black Londoner who was a black Tudor. We see a picture of him from the 1511 Westminster Tournament roll. That fact that we have John Blank, that we have this history, that we have all of those people whose biographies we saw this morning, that in itself is one of the great achievements of Black Britain and our allies, because that history was buried. It wasn't forgotten, it was buried. It was concealed, it was denied, it was disavowed, it was dismissed. That recovery of that history, the celebration of that history, the fact that we have those people, those names, those biographies, that has been half a century's labor. And many things, many aspects of the black experience were lost in that act of concealment, of marginalization. One of those acts, one of those forgotten aspects is the ways in which black people engaged in Britain's power, whether in this country, in the Americas, in Africa itself, how they found ways to be entrepreneurial, how they used their strength, their abilities, their skills, their intellect to change their conditions, to intervene and take action, to give themselves agency. Like many aspects of the Black British experience, that has been lost. You can see it in the story of John Blank, who was, in a very strange way, it's entrepreneurial, given what we know about him. We only have about 5 or 6 bits of paper to tell us about the life of John Blank, and we have those images from the Westminster Tournament roll. But one of those documents tells us how he negotiated for a pay rise. He negotiated for a pay rise because he discovered one of the other royal trumpeters, a white guy, had been paid more than him. And so he demanded a pay rise. Quite normal, except for the person to whom he had to write to make that demand was Henry VIII. Now, I've had some difficult bosses in my time. Known for their temper, known for flying off the handle, not for executing their wives. John Black not only made his demand for a pay rise to Henry VIII, Henry VIII gave it to him. When you throw everything away, when you paint over Black history, you lose every aspect of it, and we've lost our story of entrepreneurialism. And what's often said about Black history is that we have too much of a victim narrative, that we have been portrayed and perhaps allowed ourselves to be portrayed too much as victims. I think there's some truth in that, but I think it's more complicated, as historians already do. And so I want to talk about some familiar stories, some familiar histories, some familiar individuals, but try to refocus and reframe those stories to remind us that at the heart of them is agency, is the demand for agency and entrepreneurialism. I want to start in this city 200 years ago. The history of Black people in Britain in the 18th century is a series of unknowns. We've had to fight and struggle to recover what we've managed to recover from the archives, but there's still a great deal that we don't know. We only have glimpses as to how Black Britons who lived in this city in the 18th century at the height of British slavery and the slave trade, how they interacted with one another, how they tried to negotiate through this society, a society in which people lived in various forms of freedom and unfreedom, everything from full chattel slavery to freedom and even privilege. What makes all of this more frustrating is that the Black Georgians themselves, despite the gaps in the historical record, are visible to us. There are hundreds and hundreds of paintings and portraits in galleries, in private collections, all over this country that show us our Georgian ancestors. But we don't get enough from those pictures to understand their lives, their agency, their individuality. And only a handful of them were able to leave us written accounts. Most members of this community existed on the lower rungs of society. Most of them were lucky to be employees and had little chance for entrepreneurialism, but those that did repeatedly took those chances. Despite this mountain of unknowns, despite what we would long to know but probably never will, there were people who lived within the gaze of historians who were able to emerge from the historical records and tell us how they used their skills, their talents, their abilities to change their lives. One of the most significant of these is a man called Olaudah Equiano, who I know most people in this room will have heard of. And I want to speak about Equiano today, not just for what he was, a leading Black abolitionist, but also as somebody who in a remarkable way, an astonishing way, a humbling way, used his skills and his entrepreneurialism to transform his own life, to take tiny slithers of opportunity and to make them transformative. Although we don't know the exact circumstances of his birth, and they're the subject of historical controversy, we can be certain that Equiano experienced slavery and was able to escape from it. In 1789, having been a free man for 23 years, he published an autobiography, the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, Gustavus Vasa, the African, written by himself. They didn't go in for short titles in the 18th century. In the early chapters, he describes his childhood in Africa and how it was brought to an end between the ages of 8 and 11 when he and his sister were abducted, marched to the coast, separated. Equiano was shipped across the Atlantic on a British ship to Barbados. From there, he went to Virginia and was sold to a tobacco planter. And at that point, his fate would have followed that of 3.4 million others who were carried into slavery by ships that left the ports of this country. But he was sold to a British naval captain called Michael Pascal. Although the property of Michael Pascal, Equiano experienced a completely different form of slavery to that most of those 3.4 million Africans experienced. He did not live and die and suffer on the sugar fields of the Caribbean or the tobacco fields of North America. He was employed on board ships. And while working for Pascal, he traveled across the British Empire in the middle decades of the 18th century. Those travels took him to England. He served in the Royal Navy. He fought in the 7 Years' War. And then in 1762, he was sold again. By 1763, he was the property of a Quaker merchant called Robert King. with interests in Montserrat. And again, he was employed for his abilities as a navigator, as a sailor. He understood the complicated world of how those ocean-going ships in the great age of sail, how they worked. However, at that moment, he was offered a tiny slither of opportunity because he was valuable, because his skills were valuable. Robert King allowed him a very small privilege. He was allowed to trade goods wherever he was able to acquire them and sell them wherever there was a market. And over the next 3 years, he did something absolutely remarkable. He understood how this first British Empire in the Americas worked. He had traveled between islands, between mainlands, between colonies and territories, between ports and inland areas. He understood that commodities created in one area were geographically specific to that area and had different values in other geographical regions. He basically had done market research. He saw an opportunity. And he did something absolutely incredible. He gathered a tiny amount of money and he used that to grow his stock of goods. He purchased goods in one colony, sold them at a profit in another, bought new goods in that colony, sold them in another. He was constantly aware of where he was going, where he was being, what the season was, what the commodities were, and he had in his mind a price sheet. He saw value and profit everywhere. And this man, who was himself a commodity, who was himself at that moment a piece of legal property, was able to be entrepreneurial despite that. And he did this despite the fact that at any moment, every penny he'd made could be seized from him because as property, his property belonged to the man who owned him. And also because he lived in an age and in a moment and in a place where theft was everywhere. He was constantly swindled. He constantly had setbacks. He constantly had people who refused to pay, who used his race, his status as a slave, to refuse to pay him. His story at that moment was one of relative fortune. He had not, as I said, been sent to the Caribbean. He was not on the plantations. But he took that good fortune, that tiny opportunity, and did, as I said, something it's almost unimaginable to do, to be an enslaved entrepreneur. By 1766, after just 3 years, starting with nothing, he had gathered the sum of £40. That was the price that Robert King, his owner, had set Equiano to purchase his freedom. He'd set that amount because he never for a second thought Equiano would be able to raise it. And when Equiano, with the support of a ship's captain who was his friend and advocate, when he approached Robert King with the money, he tried to pull out of the deal. He was shamed as a Quaker into fulfilling his word and allowing Equiano to purchase his freedom. A deal that he'd made as a gesture, thinking it would never come to fruition. He had to follow through. A man who was property, an enslaved entrepreneur, was now a free man entirely because of his own skills, his efforts, and entrepreneurialism. As a free man, he continued to work as a sailor. In 1767, he settled in London. He returned to sea when financial circumstances dictated. He worked in all sorts of jobs. This is a man who'd been a sailor, who'd been to war. He became a hairdresser. Then he went back to sea. He went to the Arctic in the 1770s. By that decade, he did become a leading figure in London. He was able to use his connections, his skill, his knowledge, his abilities, not just to benefit himself, but to campaign for the rights of other black Londoners. This was a moment in the history of this city in which the legality of slavery was being contested and debated. This was a moment in which, not very far from where we were now, black human beings were kidnapped on the streets, put on ships on the Thames, and sent back to the plantations of the Caribbean. In the 1780s, Equiano began to campaign and draw attention to the Zong massacre, one of the worst crimes in the age of slavery from 1781. And he was also a key figure in the brief and disastrous creation of a colony in Sierra Leone, the province of freedom. There, he became briefly a government employee and then a whistleblower, pointing out the corruption of that scheme. But it was in his later life, in the 1780s, that the man who had been an enslaved entrepreneur became another sort of entrepreneur. That he did something remarkable, that he did something that is the reason why we know so much about him. He became a different sort of entrepreneur. He became an author. He realized that his story had both moral, political, and also commercial value. And he wrote his interesting narrative. He wasn't the first. Other black Georgians had written and published letters and memoirs. But Equiano's narrative was the most significant of all of them, in part because of the skill and the lucidity with which it was written, and also because it was written as part of the great abolitionist campaign. The book was released in the spring of 1789, 12 years after the Society for the Effecting of the Abolition of the Slave Trade, the first white abolitionist movement, had been founded. The interesting narrative was a biography of a man who had known slavery himself. And it was a key element. That fact that he spoke personally was a key element in the success of the book. And it had a profound impact upon all of those who read it in 1789. Yet the revolution in France meant that the momentum to abolish the slave trade was lost. The government became so horrified by the dangers of the revolution spreading that they were fearful of any radical political or commercial change, and they dismissed abolitionism as dangerous and destabilizing. And yet, what Equiano did was he deployed the skills that he'd learned while trading in the Caribbean, and he built a book, effectively, into a business. After publishing the first edition, he retained the rights to his words. Now, this was at a time when it was deemed wiser, and most writers were advised, to license their books to publish, to handing over what today we would call copyright, intellectual property, to the publishers. Equiano didn't follow the model, didn't follow the standard procedure of the time. He retained ownership of his words, of his story, of his voice. And he continued to promote the book. The interesting narrative went through a further 8 editions. Most books published in the 18th century had a single edition. That is a huge number of reprints. And each new edition was not just a reprint of the book, it was a reimagining of the book. New passages were added. Areas were expanded. It was kept up to date with ongoing developments in the struggle against slavery. This was a commodity. This book was a business. This book was not something that he had done. It was something he kept doing. A man who'd purchased his own way out of slavery was able to reimagine, revitalize, and not just a campaigning tool, but make that book the main source of income. Given the financial structures of publishing in the 18th century, this led him to acquire another set of entrepreneurial skills, that of a fundraiser. Every edition of the interesting narrative contained an expanding list of subscribers. These were wealthy individuals who had supported Equiano in the writing of the book by purchasing copies before that edition was completed. They were pre-sales, but they were also endorsements, and he was very acute at making sure that the names of famous aristocratic, celebrated literary figures, Methodist preachers like John Wesley, and members of the royal family appeared in each edition. He kept that list of subscribers constantly up to date. And he, in effect, invented something that every writer today thinks is part of our job. He basically invented the book tour. The book became, in essence, a stage show, a live event, a phenomenon. It raised money for the abolitionist cause, but also at each time he spoke, he sold additional copies of the book. And all of this before the traditions of promotion of tours had been invented. Long before the publishing industry had worked out how to do this, a man who had purchased himself when he himself was a commodity was pioneering it. Equiano has a place in the history of publishing, not just in the history of slavery and abolition. When we lose our history, we lose multiple aspects of it. Let's think of Equiano, not just as an abolitionist, not just as a man who knew slavery, but as one of the first great abolitionists, entrepreneurs in this history. And he tapped into a growing network of abolitionist supporters. This was a man who, like modern businesses, thought not just in terms of generation of wealth, but in terms of social purpose. That campaigning for abolition and that turning the book into a business went hand in hand. They weren't in conflict, they were complementary. Equiano contributed to the movement for abolition, not just as an author, but also as a campaigner and a public speaker. And it was in the 1790s that his fame grew, that he finally got married. In 1792, he married Susanna Cullen, a woman from Cambridgeshire. He had two daughters, Anna Maria and Joanna. That was before tragedy struck the family. Susanna died 3 years later, and the couple's elder daughter also passed away, as did Equiano himself. And then a man who had been enslaved as a child, a man who had been property for over a decade, was able, through all of his work, all of his ingenuity, to leave his daughter the sum of around £1,000 in an estate. That is just remarkable. Despite having been celebrated at the time of his death, Equiano's fame faded, and after his passing, the abolitionist movement advanced and evolved. In 1807, as you know, the Act for the Abolition of the Slave Trade was passed. In the 1830s, following revolutions, we should never forget, in the Caribbean, slavery itself was swept away. The histories of the abolitionist movement that were later written focused on the lives of the white abolitionists, William Wilberforce and others. Equiano's contribution, along with that of the white female abolitionists of the 1820s, was largely brushed to the margins. As I said, when we lose the history of black abolitionism, we also lose the history of black entrepreneurialism. To escape slavery in Britain, or to have escaped it in the Americas, as Equiano did, and to come to Britain, was an experience that for thousands of people, we'll never know how many, was not about going from bondage to freedom. It was about going from slavery to poverty. Equiano was exceptionally talented man. Most who escaped slavery didn't have his abilities and didn't have his luck. They usually had no trade or education to support themselves, and as a result, they lived lives that were extremely difficult. They were freed from slavery, but imprisoned by poverty. There were reasons why entrepreneurial activities and opportunities were limited in the 18th century. The way in which you got a trade in this country in the 18th and 19th centuries was you got an apprenticeship. Most enslaved people were already too old. They didn't have the family connections, and that's how you got in, how you received apprenticeships. Those who did create kinship networks very often leapt at the chance of apprenticeships. Bill Richmond, who was freed during the American Revolution, who was an enslaved man in Long Island, came to Britain and married a white woman and became an apprentice cabinet maker. The moment he got an opportunity, he leapt at it, had a job, had a skill, was really valued. He then, rather strangely, in his late 30s, decided to become a bare-knuckle boxer and became one of the most successful boxers in this country, despite being 5'8". Even former enslaved people who worked as servants struggled to survive without family contacts. They had nowhere to shelter when they were out of place, i.e. out of work between jobs. And yet, what we see time and time again is whenever a tiny slither of opportunity was made available, people pouncing upon it, building upon it. One recipient of an education, one recipient of opportunity through family, through community, was George John Scipio Africanus, who probably came from Sierra Leone, though we don't know much about his early life, and is thought to have come to Britain around 1776. He was a servant, like most black people were, in the household of Benjamin Molyneux of Wolverhampton. He was treated as a favoured servant more than an enslaved person, and he was one of the very lucky enslaved servants who was given an education. That education also led to an apprenticeship at a brass foundry. That tiny opportunity, having some schooling, having an apprenticeship, offered him a possibility of a normal life. He took that and he built on it as Equiano had. After leaving the Molyneux family, he moved to Nottingham. He married an English woman called Esther Shaw, and they together began what was called the Africanus Register of Servants. It was a Georgian employment agency. The documents still exist. They're in the archives in Nottingham. He basically listed and kept on top of a complicated list of people, clients, wealthy families looking for servants, and young men and women who were available to work in various forms of household employment. When the doors of opportunity were opened, George Africanus stepped through them. With the money he made with his wife from the employment agency, they were able to buy property. They became developers, as it were. His grave in Nottingham today is a rather ordinary-looking grave, but it belies an extraordinary life. Another figure, again, the same trajectory, enslavement, then working in the households of the wealthy as a servant, is Ignatius Sancho. Sancho was literally born on the deck of a slave ship, we think in 1729. He was given the gift of education, but only belatedly and only begrudgingly. He was brought up by 3 sisters in Greenwich who had no intention of educating. They feared that knowledge and access to books would render this young black boy unsuitable for the life of service that they were confident lay ahead of him. Although he had no reason to imagine that he would ever be permitted to live an independent life, he set out to educate himself. And in this, he was helped by an encounter with the Duke and Duchess of Montague, who lived nearby. The couple gave the young Sancho books. Eventually, he entered their household, became a butler, and after the Duke's death, with the help of the Duchess, he was able to throw himself into the world of learning. Montague left Sancho a gift of £70 and an annuity of £30. And he invested that wealth in becoming a shop owner. He leased a shop on Charles Street in Westminster. There is, wonderfully, a blue plaque marking the spot today. He became a businessman. And although he lived modestly as a shopkeeper with his wife Anne, he was also somebody who wanted to use his wealth, use his comfort to make the most of life. His achievements were not purely entrepreneurial, they were also cultural. He was engaged in literary correspondence with Laurence Sterne. He had his portrait painted by Reynolds. He became friends with a number of eminent Georgians, including the great actor David Garrick. The critical and commercial success of his letters, published after his death, has been put down to his own talents. He was an absolutely remarkable figure who not just wrote his letters that were published, he was a composer. And he came to occupy a place within Georgian society that, on the face of it, should have been impossible. In 2 respects, Sancho was somebody who, if you were going to pitch it as a drama, people would say that's not likely. It makes Bridgerton look realistic. Because Sancho was a shopkeeper, he had property, which meant he had the right to vote. One of the things we can say about British history is there was no laws saying that people could vote or couldn't vote based on skin colour, although those laws, of course, did exist in the British Empire. Because he had property, his skin colour was irrelevant, and Sancho is the first person we know of, probably the first person of colour ever to vote in a British election. It's also remarkable because when Sancho's letters were published after his death, they were reviewed in the newspapers. The review talked about Sancho as a grocer, a character immortalised by his correspondence with Laurence Sterne. They talked about his character. They didn't even mention that he was an African, a black man. This at a time when Britain was at the height of its involvement in slavery and the slave trade. That habit of losing our history again means we lose the entrepreneurial aspects of it. The fight that we've had to fight to get slavery into the national conversation means we've focused on slavery and abolition. And sometimes the entrepreneurial elements of the voices and the people that we've exhumed has been pushed to the margins. Now is a good time. Now is the right time to start stressing that that is an aspect of repeatedly of the lives that we know, the people that we've put in the curriculum. I'm running out of time, so I'll tell you about one other figure who we should also think, not just in the way we do, but as an entrepreneur. Mary Seacole today is on the national curriculum, though not in many schools. She's compared to Florence Nightingale, I think, unwisely. She's remembered as a doctress, a woman who pioneered the use of traditional remedies from the Caribbean in the treatment of all sorts of illnesses. She was in epidemics all over the world, Panama, in Jamaica. She was in, of course, the Crimean War. She is somebody today who we've rightly recovered and restored to the place that she enjoyed in the late 1850s when she was one of, arguably the most famous black woman in the British Empire. But you can't understand Mary Seacole as a doctress, as a traveller, without understanding her first and foremost as an entrepreneur. When she first visited Britain in the 1820s, like Sancho visiting the islands of the Caribbean, she was engaged in market research. On her next visit, she came with a huge stock of West Indian pickles and preserves that she then sold. We know from the account of the Windrush generation how boring the British diet was in the 1950s. Hard to imagine how awful it must have been in the 1820s, how desperate people were for pickles and preserves. She constantly was improvising new business opportunities. She was constantly engaged in finding opportunities, in buying and selling. Her family ran a boarding house, and she took that tradition of the family boarding house and she took it to war. In the 1850s, she came back to Britain. She requested multiple times to be allowed to go and work as a doctress in the Crimean War, to serve the British Army at a time of war. She was denied repeatedly. So what she did again was absolutely remarkable. She paid for her own passage. Her and her business partner opened in the Crimea near the British base at Balaclava what she called the British Hotel. It was an officer's mess that also was a restaurant and at times a convalescent facility, not quite a hospital, but a place where people, officers who could afford it, went to recover from their wounds. The image we have of Mary Seacole, quite rightly and understandably, is that of the medical work that she was engaged with in the Crimean War. And there is every reason to suggest that there was efficacy, that those traditional herbal treatments did ease the passage, ease the pain of soldiers wounded in that war. But we need to focus as well on the hotel, on the facility that she built. It was described by one soldier at the time as a place where you could buy everything from a needle to an anchor. Mary Seacole's story is absolutely remarkable, but we need to add that other element to it. This is a woman who went into a war zone, having been denied official representation, having been rebuffed by the authorities, and set up a business, set up a facility that served and provided for the British Army in what is in a part of the world where there is today, in 2023, an ongoing war. The Crimea is, of course, part of Ukraine. She is an extraordinary and celebrated figure, but again, we're missing that element of her life. And there's one other group of people in the time that I have left I want to talk about who are just as entrepreneurial, and recently, just a couple of weeks ago, we celebrated their history. When we think about the Windrush generation, we need to think about them as entrepreneurs. These were people who, again, did market research. They had skills, and they read the newspapers and understood that their skills were more valuable in Britain than they were in the islands and territories where they were. And they did a rational entrepreneurial transaction. They wanted to get paid more for their skills. Britain, at that point, needed 1.3 million workers. Britain was hemorrhaging skilled workers. Britain had an enormous act of recovery and repair after the war to do. And people 4,000 miles away read the newspapers and did the maths, did the calculations, and wanted to get a better rate for their skills by putting it into a global market. And they also wanted to do it because they were subjects of that empire, with every right to take their skills to any part of that empire where they were more valuable. The document that, thankfully, survived the focus of the Home Office and was not weeded out and destroyed is the manifest, the passenger list of the Windrush. Now remember, this is a country that needs 1.3 million workers just to stand still, just to begin the process of rebuilding in 1948. On board that single ship were 85 mechanics, 54 carpenters, 39 clerks, 23 welders, 20 engineers, 15 machinists, 14 fitters, 13 electricians, 12 civil servants, 10 shoemakers, 3 boxers, 2 piano repairers, 2 hairdressers, a potter, a hatter, and the Trinidadian calypso singer, Lord Kitchener. Each and every one of them an entrepreneur, each and every one of them doing what we all do when we start out, looking at our skills, when we have nothing to trade but our skills, but our talents, but our enthusiasm, and taking it to a global market, exercising their rights as what they always were and always will be, which is citizens of the British Empire, to travel within their empire and make the most of themselves, which is, after all, what all of us, that's what we all want. Thank you very much.